The ship was dying, and Mira Chen was the only one who knew it. She'd been running numbers in her head since the third hour of the watch. Cross, referencing the output from the port thruster manifold against the coolant pressure readings on the secondary loop, the ones the Keth monitoring array wasn't bothering to track because, as far as anyone in the Conclave's observation deck was concerned, a 17-year-old girl from the Situ Administrative Cooperative didn't do calculus in her sleep. She did. She'd been doing it since she was 9. When her grandmother pressed a dog-eared engineering manual into her hands and said, "Learn what they think you can't." So Mira knew. The ship was dying, and they had maybe 14 hours before it became everybody else's problem. She pressed her back against the cold corridor wall of the helix and breathed through her nose. 4 counts in, 4 counts out, the way Commander Vasek had taught her during pre-mission stress conditioning. Vasek was in the quarantine bay now, had been for 6 hours. Ever since the Keth atmospheric probe had released something into the ship's recycled air that the commander's immune system found catastrophically disagreeable. The Keth had been very apologetic about it, very formal, very certain that it would resolve itself within 30 to 40 hours, well within mission parameters. The helix had roughly 14 before the coolant situation became a hull integrity situation. Mira did not consider these facts compatible. She pushed off the wall and walked toward the engine room, keeping her footfalls quiet out of habit. The helix was a big ship, laughably oversized for a crew of 4, which was the point. The Keth Conclave had insisted on providing the vessel for humanity's first collaborative deep space assessment mission, and the Keth built everything large because they were large. 8 feet of chitinous exoskeleton, 4 manipulator limbs, compound eyes, the color of hammered copper. They communicated through resonance patterns that their translation nodes converted into something approximating human speech. A low, reverberant hum that Mira felt in her back molars more than she heard with her ears. There were 3 Keth aboard as cultural liaisons. There were 3 humans, Mira, Dio Adewal from the Lagos Engineering Collective, and Ren Kowalski Park from the Warsaw Defense Sciences Institute. Mira was the youngest by 4 years and the only one without a doctorate. She had been selected because she'd won the Global STEM Aptitude Survey, a competition entered by 900,000 applicants, and because the Keth Selection Committee, upon reviewing the results, had specifically requested the one who scored highest in adaptive systems thinking. She had tried not to be proud of that. She'd mostly failed. The engine room door cycled open with a sigh of pressurized air. Deo was already inside, crouched over the secondary coolant junction with a diagnostic tablet in one hand and a stylus in his teeth. He was 22, built like a man who'd spent his adolescence doing physical labor, which he had. His family ran a fabrication cooperative, and he'd been repairing industrial equipment since he was old enough to hold a wrench. He looked up when she entered, the stylus out of his mouth. "You see it too," he said. Not a question. 6 hours ago. She moved to the port manifold display and pulled up the cascade projections. "I was hoping I was wrong. You weren't." He set the tablet down on the deck and rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture she'd come to recognize as Dio's version of controlled panic. "Secondary loop is going to fail before we can route around it, and when it does, the thermal regulation for the core goes with it. 14 hours. I had 13. But yeah, they looked at each other across the engine room. Somewhere above them the ship hummed, that vast, constant, Keth-engineered vibration that never quite felt like silence even when nothing was happening. Mira had spent the first 3 days of the mission and unable to sleep because of it. By day 5 she'd stopped noticing. Now it was just the sound of where she lived. "We need to tell Ren," Dio said. "We need to tell the Keth." He made a face. "Hostility. Something more complicated than that." Deo had grown up in a city that had spent 40 years in a disputed resource zone, negotiating with Keth colonial surveying teams over mineral extraction rights. He didn't hate the Keth. He just never forgot that they had a different definition of collaborative. "They're going to tell us to evacuate to the auxiliary pod and let the ship autocorrect," he said. "Probably. The autocorrect protocol has a 32% success rate on secondary loop failures." "I know. 32%, Mira. I know." She crossed to the tertiary access panel, The one the Keth liaison, Vethashan, had told them during orientation was outside the parameters of crew interaction and crouched in front of it. The panel was sealed with a Keth magnetic lock, a flat disc of dark material that pulsed faintly in a 3-beat rhythm. She'd been studying the rhythm for a week. I also know that if we can physically bypass the secondary loop and route coolant flow directly through the emergency manifold in the aft section, we buy ourselves another 30 hours. Enough to get to the Cassini waypoint and get Vasek real medical attention. Deo stared at her, then at the panel, then at her again. That panel, he said slowly, is outside the parameters of crew interaction. Yes, Vethashan was very clear about that. He was. He's going to be extremely upset. Mira pulled a thin metal tool from her boot, a piece of stripped wire she'd spent 2 evenings shaping into a probe, and studied the lock. He's also 8 feet tall, made of chitin, currently in the observation lounge, recalibrating his resonance nodes after a 6-hour monitoring shift. He won't be upset for at least 40 minutes. Ren appeared in the doorway behind her, breathing hard. He was the oldest of them at 25, round-faced and perpetually worried-looking, with a habit of pushing his glasses up his nose, even though they were magnetically fitted and didn't actually slip. He was doing it now. I heard everything he said, through the intercom. I wasn't eavesdropping. The intercom carries further than. It doesn't matter. He pushed his glasses up. 14 hours, 13 and a half now, Deo said. Tren exhaled through his teeth. What's in the panel? Emergency manifold access, Keth built, but the routing architecture is based on human hydraulic systems. They adapted it from our design specs when they built the ship. I've been reading the manual. What manual? Vethashan said there was no manual for crew. There's no manual for crew, Mira agreed. There's a construction document filed with the Keth Shipwrights Registry that's publicly accessible through the Conclave Archive, if you know what to search for. She glanced back at him. I know what to search for. Silence. Then Ren made the sound he made when he was committing to something. A short, sharp exhale, like a man stepping off a ledge. Tell me what you need me to do. What she needed was 40 minutes of uninterrupted access. Dio's hands in spaces too tight for hers, and Ren standing at the corridor junction to signal if any of the Keth liaisons moved toward the engine room. What she got was all three. A stray wire she hadn't accounted for, that sent a small charge through her left hand, and made her bite the inside of her cheek, to keep from swearing out loud. The lock cycled open on her 3rd attempt. The panel beyond it was a nest of conduits and relay nodes, built to Keth proportions, which meant everything was slightly too large, and the labeling was in resonance script that she'd spent a month learning to read phonetically. She identified the emergency manifold line by color. The Keth used a chromatic coding system that overlapped significantly with human industrial standards, which she'd noted in her mission preparation, and which Vethashan had responded to with something that translated as pleasing observation. A resonance pattern she'd come to understand as condescending approval. Okay, she said quietly. Dio, I need you to hold the blue-banded line while I disconnect the secondary junction. If I get the timing wrong, we're going to get a pressure surge. Bad. Bruise bad. Not hospitalization bad. I can work with bruise bad. He reached in, his hands larger than hers, steadier. She'd noticed early on that Dio's hands were always steady. He'd told her once that when you'd spent enough years working on equipment that could kill you, if you made a mistake, your hands either learned to be steady or you found a different job. They worked. Ren's voice came in low intervals from the corridor. Clear, clear, clear. And each time Mira felt something in her chest unknot by a fraction. The rewiring took 22 minutes. The rerouting took 9 more. When she triggered the emergency manifold and heard the deep, slow pulse of coolant beginning its new path through the aft section, she sat back on her heels and just breathed for a moment. The thermal display updated, steady, holding. Dio let out a breath that might, under different circumstances, have been a laugh. Ren appeared in the doorway, glasses pushed up, and looked at the display and said nothing, but his expression said enough. Mira was reaching to close the panel when the corridor light changed. That particular amber tint that meant a Keth liaison was in the compartment section. She closed the panel. She did not lock it. There wasn't time. Vethashan entered the engine room at full height, all 8 feet of him, turt, manipulator limbs folded in the configuration the humans had learned to read as formal attention. His compound eyes moved across the room in the way compound eyes did. Not sequentially, but all at once, taking everything in simultaneously. The resonance pattern that followed took 3 seconds for the translation node to process. The emergency manifold, the node said, in its careful approximation of a human voice, has been activated. Yes, Mira said. Another resonance pattern, longer, more complex. The node translated. The tertiary access panel was sealed by Keth registry lock. The seal requires a Keth-registered frequency key to open. It does, Mira agreed. It also opens to a manually constructed harmonic probe if you spend enough time studying the lock's pulse interval. She held up the wire tool between 2 fingers, and then set it down on the deck in a motion she'd learned to read as the human equivalent of setting a weapon on the table rather than raising it. The secondary coolant loop was going to fail in 14 hours, 10.5 by the time we started. The autocorrect protocol has a 32% success rate. I chose not to use it. Vethashan was still. The Keth could go very, very still. Their biology had no equivalent of the human nervous fidget, no micro-expressions, no tells. Mira had spent 2 weeks learning to read stillness as its own language. This stillness was different from formal attention. She'd seen it once when the Conclave's senior assessor had revealed the route deviation around the Kareth belt. It was the stillness of recalibration. The resonance that followed was the longest she'd heard from Vethashan. Translation node processed it in parts. The emergency manifold activations will stabilize the vessel's thermal systems for approximately 31 hours. Sufficient to reach the Cassini waypoint. The commander's condition will benefit significantly from waypoint medical facilities. A pause, in which the resonance fell to a register below the node's translation threshold. Then, you read the shipwright registry filing. I did. That document is not in standard archive notation. It requires proficiency in registry procedural format, is a formal Keth administrative discipline. I had a month, Mira said. And a very good search protocol. Another silence. Then something extraordinary happened. Vethashan's secondary manipulator limbs, the smaller pair, which the Keth used for fine work and which the humans had noticed, they moved when experiencing what the translation literature called emotional resonance, extended slightly and then folded. Again, it was the equivalent of an intake of breath. You were aware, the node said carefully, that activating the emergency manifold without Keth authorization was a violation of the mission parameters. I was. And you did it anyway.
Mission parameters,
Mira said. Didn't account for the secondary loop failure, and Commander Vasek needed to get to the waypoint. She held the Keth's copper compound gaze, without looking away, which she'd learned early on, was either respectful or confrontational, depending on text, and had decided to make it respectful by sheer force of intention. I prioritized the crew. The secondary manipulator limbs moved again, and then, for the first time in 6 weeks of mission contact, Vethashan did something that had never appeared in any of the liaison briefings, any of the cultural documentation, any of the 40 years of Keth human diplomatic record that Mira had read in preparation for this mission. He lowered himself. Not entirely. The Keth did not kneel. Their anatomy didn't permit it in the human sense, but he shifted his primary limb, configuration into the lower formal register, the one used in Keth ceremony when addressing someone of recognized competence. The gesture was so outside their expected interaction frame that Dio made a small involuntary sound, and Ren actually stopped breathing. Keth. Conclave, the translation node said, has engaged in significant discussion regarding the question of whether human biological systems, particularly the juvenile developmental stages, are capable of the necessary adaptive reasoning for deep space operations. The assessment has been ongoing for 40 years. The resonance underneath the words shifted into something that Mira couldn't quite name, but that, just against the back of her sternum. The current mission is part of that assessment. The room was very quiet. I know, Mira said. Deo looked at her sharply. Ren made a sound. You knew, the node said, and the resonance in it was not quite a question. I suspected. The mission structure didn't fit standard collaborative assessment parameters. The crew-to-vessel ratio was wrong, The emergency response system were set to create isolated decision points rather than integrated crew response, and the atmospheric probe incident that put Commander Vasek in quarantine was, she paused, too perfectly timed, too cleanly bounded. Commander's symptoms are real. I checked the medical readouts, but the probe release wasn't an accident. The Conclave wanted to see what we'd do without adult supervision. She looked at Vethashan steadily. I decided to do the thing that kept everyone alive. The secondary manipulators moved a third time. And then, the translation node produced something that had no close human equivalent, resonance pattern that the Keth used in specific ceremonial contexts. The acknowledgement, so the cultural documentation said, of a peer. Yes, the node said. That is what you did. They reached the Cassini waypoint in 29 hours. Commander Vasek was transferred to the Waypoint Medical Bay, where the doctors confirmed that her immune response had been triggered by a trace compound in the atmospheric probe, recoverable, they said, within 72 hours. She was sitting up in her bunk when the three of them came in, and she looked at them with the particular expression of a person who has been briefed on recent events and is not entirely sure how to categorize she's feeling. I hear, she said, that you rewired the emergency manifold. Mira did, Deo said immediately. We held things and kept watch. That's not, Mira started. It's accurate, Ren said, in the important respects. Vasek studied Mira for a long moment. She was 43, career deep space systems engineer. The kind of person whose face showed everything she'd survived without quite showing how it had cost her. She had been, Mira had decided in the first week, the best kind of commander. The kind who gave you enough room to figure things out on your own and enough structure to know what the room was for. Vethashan sent a preliminary report to the Conclave, Vasek said. I've read it. He used the peer acknowledgement resonance in the notation. Do you know how often that gets used in formal Conclave correspondence? No, Mira said. Neither do I. Because there's no record of it being used in human Keth documentation before. Vasek leaned back against her pillow. So, what do you want to be when you grow up? A systems engineer, Mira said. Deep space certification. Good. The commander closed her eyes. The says, after this, you're going to have a hard time getting anyone to tell you you're not qualified. What Mira didn't tell Commander Vasek, what she hadn't told anyone yet, not even Dio, she'd had come to think of. As a friend in the way that pressure forges friendships, quickly and with no room for pretension, was what she'd found in the third hour of the manifold rerouting, when she'd been elbow-deep in the Keth conduit architecture, and a secondary display had flickered on and shown her something she wasn't supposed to see. It was a data packet, Keth administrative format, registry notation, timestamp to the mission start date. She'd read it in fragments while her hands worked, parsing the registry procedural format that she'd spent a month learning. It had taken her of the repair time to understand what she was reading. The Conclave's assessment of humanity had been ongoing for 40 years, as Vethashan had said. What the data packet revealed was that the assessment had a threshold, a specific set of conditions that, if met, trigger a formal Conclave recommendation. Not just for expanded deep space collaboration, for something the registry notation called co-navigational status. A formal recognition that humanity was, in the Keth framework, a peer civilization rather than a developing one. The political and economic implications of that designation were, as far as Mira could calculate, enormous. Threshold conditions included 17 parameters. She'd only had time to read 8 before the manifold work was done. But one of them was clear. Demonstration of adaptive technical reasoning under isolated emergency conditions by a member of the biological developmental stage prior to full cognitive maturation. A child, doing the thing the adults assumed a child couldn't do. She sat on her bunk at the Cassini waypoint, the sounds of the station moving around her. The distant machinery, the voices in other languages, the ship hum of a place where people lived and worked in the dark between stars. And she thought about her grandmother pressing that engineering manual into her hands, about 900,000 applicants, about the way Vethashan had lowered himself in the engine room, and the sound the translation node had made that had no close human equivalent. She thought about Fedya Druzhinin, Sveta Ishanova, Sasha, Ivanenko, the three Soviet children from the old Earth stories her grandmother had told her, the ones who'd thought they were flying to space and turned out to be in a simulation, who'd proved the point the experiment needed proving anyway. Those names meant nothing to the Keth. They didn't need to. The point was the same. She pulled out her tablet and opened a new document. She had 7 more parameters to decode. The formal debrief happened 6 weeks later, back on Earth, in a conference room in Geneva with more flags on the walls than Mira had previously seen in one place. There were Keth representatives, not Vethashan, but senior conclave figures, their translation nodes the expensive kind, that produced speech with something closer to warmth. There were human officials she recognized from news feed coverage. There was Commander Vasek, fully recovered, sitting at the far end of the table, with the expression of someone who already knew how this was going to go. The Keth senior assessor spoke first. The translation node rendered it carefully. The mission of the Helix produced data of significance to the Conclave's ongoing assessment. Specifically, the response of the human crew members to the secondary coolant loop emergency demonstrated adaptive reasoning capacities that exceed the Conclave's standard predictive models. Mira sat very still. Furthermore, the node continued, the identification and recovery of the mission assessment framework by crew member Chen demonstrates a category of integrative intelligence, pattern synthesis across disparate technical and cultural domains that the Conclave had not previously recorded in human populations of the relevant developmental stage. The human official to her left, she didn't know his name, he had the face of someone whose name she was supposed to know, leaned toward her and murmured, "Do you know what they're about to say?" She did. She'd known for 6 weeks, from the moment she'd finished reading the data packet. She'd said nothing, because it wasn't hers to announce. It was the Conclave's, and they had their own ceremony, and she had learned enough about Keth culture to understand that the ceremony was the thing, not just the conclusion. The Conclave, the senior assessor said, has voted to recommend the designation of co-navigational status for the human civilization. The room was silent for exactly 2 seconds, then it wasn't. Sat in the center of it and watched the humans around her. The officials, the functionaries, the commander at the end of the table, who caught her eye, and gave her a small nod that meant, "You did this, you know that." And she thought about the engineering manual, dog-eared and dense, pressed into her hands in a small apartment in Sichuan by a woman who had spent whole life knowing what her granddaughter was capable of. She thought about Dio's steady hands in the conduit space, about Ren excelling like a man stepping off a ledge, about the way they'd worked together in the dark of the engine room, with the ship dying around them and 14 hours on the clock, and how the thing that had gotten them through wasn't any single person's brilliance but all 3 of them, each bringing the specific weight of what they knew, fitting together the way components fit when you've read the schematic and you trust the design. She thought about the fact that the Keth had been watching humans for 40 years, looking for proof of something, and that in the end the proof had come not from a diplomat or a general or a scientist with decades of credentials, from 3 kids in an engine room who had looked at a 32% success rate and decided to do the math themselves. Vethashan was not in the room, but when she returned to the Helix 2 days later for the post-mission systems inspection, a formality, the ship was in perfect condition. She found him in the engine room, standing in front of the tertiary access panel, his secondary manipulators folded in a configuration she'd started to learn. "You came back," the translation node said. "Systems inspection," she said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. The resonance beneath the silence was low, the kind she'd started to feel in her back teeth, without consciously listening for it. "You read the full parameter set." She didn't ask how he knew. The Keth were not stupid. "Yes." "How long did it take you?" 6 weeks. The last 4 parameters were in a notation format I hadn't encountered before. I had to reconstruct the grammar from context. The secondary manipulators moved. She'd been cataloging their movements for 2 months, and she thought, she was not certain, the Keth were always going to be alien enough that she'd be guessing at the edges, that the gesture was something like amusement. Not condescending. The other kind. The last four parameters, he said, are written in the archival notation of the Keth Shipwrights Registry, 7th century, conclave formation. It is not taught. There are 11 living Keth who can read it without a translation reference. She said nothing for a moment. Then, 12 now. The secondary manipulators moved again. And, this time the resonance that accompanied it was one she'd never heard before. Something that pressed differently against her chest, not just in her teeth but behind her ribs, warm in a way that had no translation equivalent, a way she thought might not need one. 12 now. Greed. She didn't become famous for saving the ship. That story was never told publicly. It was absorbed into the mission reports, noted in the Keth formal records, referenced obliquely in the co-navigational status announcement. The press covered the announcement itself, 40 years of assessment, a formal designation, the historic expansion of humanity's standing in the Keth conclave framework. They printed photographs of the senior officials and the Keth representatives and the flags on the wall in Geneva. Mira was in one of those photographs, at the edge of the frame, mostly cropped out. She didn't mind. Dio went back to Lagos, back to his family's fabrication cooperative, and sent her messages about the reactor project he was designing and the crew he was putting together, and once a photograph of him standing in front of a new piece of industrial equipment with his hand on it and his expression belonging to a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. She sent back a photograph of the Cassini waypoint at the moment the sun, their sun, rose over the station, horizon, a thin line of gold against the dark. Ren got a position at the Warsaw Institute, Advanced Systems Track, and started publishing papers on emergency decision-making in isolated high-pressure environments. His fourth paper cited the Helix mission extensively. He thanked Mira in the acknowledgments as the most unnerving I have ever had the privilege of watching work under pressure, which she considered accurate. Commander Vasek took another deep space posting and sent Mira a recommendation letter that was, by every account from the people who read it, somewhere between a commendation and a formal declaration that the writer intended to be vindicated by history. And Mira went back to school, not because she had to, but because there were still things she didn't know. She'd inherited from her grandmother the deep conviction that the things you didn't know yet were the most interesting part of the map. She was sitting in an orbital mechanics seminar, 3 months after Geneva, when her tablet chimed with a message from a Keth registry address she recognized. She opened it under the desk, the way she'd learned to do in secondary school when she was reading engineering manuals during history lectures. The message was in archival notation, 7th century, pre-conclave formation. There was no translation attached. She didn't need one. It said, "The conclave has approved funding for a second assessment mission. Crew selection begins in 60 days. The senior assessor requests that human crew be selected with attention to adaptive systems thinking." And then, below the formal text, in the same archival notation, but in a register, she'd started to identify as something between informal and personal. A register she wasn't sure the Keth were supposed to use in registry correspondence. A single additional line. "We would like, if possible, to have 12 again." She closed the tablet. She looked up at the orbital mechanics display. The slow wheel of celestial bodies and their relationships. The mathematics of where things were going, and how to get there, and what you needed to know to make the crossing. She thought about her grandmother, about the dog-eared manual, about Dio's hands and Ren's exhale and the sound of coolant moving through a rerouted system in the dark of an engine room while the clock ran down. Then she opened the tablet again and started writing her application. There was a moment, just before she submitted it, when she thought about what the Keth had believed before the Helix mission, that children, humans in the developmental stage before full cognitive maturation, weren't capable of the adaptive reasoning that deep space demanded. The universe required a certain kind of mind, credentialed, experienced, fully formed. She thought about how that belief had made sense from the outside. How you'd look at a 17-year-old girl from Sichuan, entered in a competitions against 900,000 other people, and you'd calculate the odds, and you'd design your slashulation, and you'd put her on a ship and see what she did. And then she thought about what it had felt like to be in that engine room. The cold of the floor through her knees, the smell of ozone and recycled air, the wire probe in her hand, and the number 14 running through her head like a metronome. And she thought about the fact that she had not once, in that entire sequence of events, believed the problem was unsolvable. That was the thing. That was what the Keth had been trying to measure for 40 years, and what no amount of formal assessment had ever quite captured until they'd set it up and let it run. It wasn't the credentials, it wasn't even the intelligence, though intelligence helped. It was the specific human refusal, in the face of a clock and a 32% success rate, and a panel that said, outside the parameters of crew interaction, except that the problem was unsolvable. Mira had grown up in a world that had been telling her that various things were outside her parameters since she was old enough to read. She had developed, in response, a bone-deep allergy to the word outside, when it was followed by parameters. She submitted the application. Then she opened a new document, switched her notation system to the archival 7th century format, and began to draft a response to Veth Thashan that started with the formal greeting of recognized peers and ended with a question about the third parameter set she hadn't been able to fully decode yet. She'd been working on it for 2 weeks. There was a nuance in the phrasing that she wasn't sure she had right. She wanted to get it right. Outside the seminar window, the orbital mechanics display turned slowly, and Earth was a blue curve at the bottom of it, and beyond that were the waypoints and the conclave, and the dark between stars that humans were, as of 6 weeks ago, formally recognized to be old enough to navigate. She hadn't saved the world. She'd rewired a coolant system, and read a document that wasn't meant for her. She'd done the math when the math needed doing, and held a gaze that she'd decided to make respectful by sheer force of intention, and sat in an engine room with 2 other people who trusted her enough to follow her hands. The world, it turned out, didn't need saving. It needed someone willing to do the work. Mira Chen was very good at the work. She wrote the message. She sent it. She turned back to the orbital mechanics display and thought about the 60 days until crew selection and the parameters she still hadn't decoded, and the dark between stars waiting patiently, the way the dark always waited, because the dark had time. Humanity, it had recently learned, did too.